It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity.
Good evening, model citizens. Welcome to Humanity Junction. My name is Heath, and tonight is Modeling Monday, and we're going to be talking a little bit about layout design. But before we get to that, we're going to show some of the model railroading live shows to that side, left to the left side. If you have a regular model railroading show or a live show and don't see your name up on that list, please send myself or John at Schuylkill River Valley an email and we'll get you added up there. Speaking about the schedule, tonight at 8 o'clock, Tom is not going to be going on. But as per the list, there are two other people that live stream on Monday nights. We've got Tyler from Lackawanna Railfan as well as Nick from Nick's Train. So with Tom not being here tonight, please join one of those other two guests. Other two streamers. I got a little distracted by one of my guests. I wasn't sure if his chair was holding steady or not as he was sitting in the basement. Let's say hello and just check in with the people in the chat. We got Almar joining us. We got Bang Got You Junction. Carl is here as well. Vinny from BNSF 6951 is here. Dad Cook's in the house. We've got Dave from BNSF N Scale as well. We've got Drew Dude's Model Trains. Dragon Lover 68. Dragon, I've always wanted to ask you what type of dragons do you like? Joe Rader, Black Rock Central Railroad is here. Manny Fernandez, thanks for joining us as well. We've got Alan from Mason-Dixon Railroad. We've got Nisi J. We've got Norm Miller is here as well. Roy Eltham checking in from the West Coast. We've got John from Schuylkill River Valley as well. We've got Steve Childers and Steve 87th PSAP. Looks like Norman Rose coming in. We've got Greg from Midsummer N Scale coming in as well. Thank you all for being here. If I missed your name, I apologize, but please say hello to each other in the chat. And just because you're here, Steve 87th PSAP asked a question last night, and I forgot to get back to it, so I'll answer it right now. He commented that we started the show 2 minutes late, and that is correct. I always start the show 2 minutes after the hour, and that's actually an old theater thing. I come from theater, and if you've ever gone and seen a theater show, you'll notice that an 8 o'clock curtain really means 8:05. So people just That's just when people happen to show up, or not show up, but they leave that extra 5 minutes so that the latecomers can show up, and that's just sort of how it is. Let's take a quick look. We got a couple people in the basement. We'll bring them up and say hello, and then I've got a little show and tell. We've got Jason the Train Freak. We've got Robert from Flying Crow, and we have our guest, Byron Henderson, is here as well. How's everyone doing?
Great. Good.
Awesome. Robert, you made me nervous when you came up. I saw, it looked like I just saw your hat moving back and forth, and I thought we were having another flying episode.
No.
Oh,
You only want one of those to a customer. You don't get any more.
Good. So just a little show and tell real quick before we get into our conversation with Byron. I was on a Michael McCarville stream recently, and they were talking about something called the glue looper. And I kept saying, what in the world are you talking about? What is a glue looper? The other thing that came up was a little finger knife. And I showed this on another live stream, but they kind of all go together because these little glue loopers will replace the standard X-Acto blade. And apparently what they do is they help get the glue exactly where you want it. So there's 3 different sizes. There's the version 2, the version 3, and the version 4. And supposedly they all help get the glue where you want it. So I'll give those a try at some point. We'll see how that goes. The other thing that I did want to share with people is that my new space is actually coming along. They actually started demo today. So if we bring that up, this is they're going to remove all this glass, and this glass is one sort of big space. And I am actually on the other side. So this side you see kind of there in the. I don't know if you can see my my cursor or not, but my office is going to be this little side here, and you can see they've actually taken where the door is going to be, and the door is just going to be lined up with that window. And if we go inside, you can see there's that same window, and then the doorway is over here on the left. So it's coming along. They're going to basically take down that glass and hopefully put up these 2 walls, and hopefully they're going to put it up quickly. And yeah, we'll see. I do have some designs. I hate this design because I've only got 16.7 inches kind of between the layout and where the desk is going to go. The desk will be on wheels, so I'll be able to roll it a little bit closer to that window. But I'm sure one of the things we're going to talk about today with layout design is going to be aisle width, and 16.7 inches coming in the main door, getting into sort of the space, not quite sure how that's going to work out. I do have another version, though, where, because these are all T-Track modules, so I can do a different configuration, which gives me almost 4 feet between the layout and the desk. The problem with this orientation is that I don't have the tables to put it on in this configuration. So the other configuration is using stuff I have. This configuration is where I hope to go eventually once I sort of have the room. And I've got a little like 3 foot by 3 foot area in the corner, and that's probably going to be like a little workstation, paint station kind of thing like that. And one last thing. So this setup is basically using everything that I have, but being as tonight's about layout design, one of the things I did is I was like, well, what if I started from scratch and had nothing? So I watched Byron's video earlier, And Byron, I'm going to run through the 6 main steps to successful layout design that I got from
Only
watching your
three.
video earlier.
There's only three.
Well, see, I got 6 though. Okay. So
Okay.
number 1 was open CAD. First step.
Okay,
Number
that's
2.
a fail right off the bat.
Number 2. I got a couple more. Hold on. Number 2. Add 18-inch bench work around the outside of the room, or a 4x8 in the center of the room. Number
Right.
3, we'd add a helix. Number 4, use Google Map for prototypical track plans and basically just take those and throw them right on your layout. Include the largest yard possible. And number 6, last but not least, always use number 8 turnouts. So, how was I close?
That's suboptimal, I'd say.
I'm joking a little bit. These are kind of some of the things that Byron actually talks about in one of the presentations that he does. Kind of not things not to do, but kind of things that everybody does that
You lost Heath.
I need to stop doing that. I keep doing that. But things you should maybe, rethink as you're designing stuff. So, Byron, why don't you just real quickly, who are you?
It's a question I ask often.
Yeah, I know. Well,
So I am a custom model railroad layout designer. It surprises me too,
Yeah.
but I design layouts for people. I also edit a magazine called the Layout Design Journal, which is published by the Layout Design SIG. And I do some technical marketing consulting as well, but that's not nearly as much fun to talk about. So I've been doing custom model railroad designs for about 17 years now. I've done a couple hundred designs for other people. I've been editing the magazine for, 10 years or so. And I've been around the hobby for a long time. The Bay Area where I live, Northern California, is great for, there's so many layouts, so much going on. So I have a lot of great friends, a lot of great layouts to visit and operate on once we get back to doing that. I started out looking at John Armstrong's track planning for realistic operation. I bought the book in a hobby shop. You remember hobby shops?
yeah.
And just thought this makes sense. This is systematic. This is based on concepts, and it kind of grew from there.
If people don't know, this is
my
just,
spokesmodel, Heath.
I know. This is just the book that he mentioned, Track Planning for Realistic Operations. I actually think that I bought this in like 1988 or something like that. And I've just had it forever. And if you notice, it's still in perfect condition, never opened, never read, never looked at. But one day.
Yeah, you put it under your pillow at night,
Right.
and just sort of assimilate it. I think that might work.
It helps. It helps prop other things up. But,
yeah. So in some ways, the book has become dated. There's a brand new book by my friend Lance Midheim on model railroad layout design. I haven't seen that, but there are some basics that have just stayed true. The other thing about track planning for realistic operation is it was written in the 50s or 60s, actually. So for those of us who model the transition era, there's a lot in that reflects that era. So it's kind of more useful in some ways than some things that are newer.
Yeah, and I have the 3rd edition as well, which I believe is the one that came out in the 80s or something. They redid it a couple times, depending on which version.
The 3rd edition has some additions to the book for modern railroading that I think are not up to par with the rest of the book. but any of the editions are great. I have the early editions. I still look at them once in a while. As I say, some of it is dated, some of it is evergreen. And that's really how I got my start, is looking at that and comparing what John Armstrong was talking about with what was getting published in the magazines, which was mostly 4x8s that didn't have a concept, didn't tell a story. And I think that's the thing that I took away from Armstrong, maybe even took more than was actually there, but that the idea that we tell, you want to tell a story. So when someone comes in and looks at your layout or operates on your layout, they understand something about what you're trying to say. There's a concept, there's a theme, that really has carried over in a lot of the things that I do for clients.
Yeah, before we get too far into your methodology for layout design, I just want to let Jason and Robert are joining us as well. They're both at different stages in their layout design, or I should say layout build process as well. And I just thought like it'd be great to have some other people up here as well. So we have these two guys as well as all the people in chat. So if people have questions along the way, feel free to post them and we'll get to them as we can. But Jason, if you just want to say hello and let us know where you're at in your model building adventure.
So my name is Jason. I call myself the train freak because, I mean, why not, right? No one else had the name, so I took it. But as far as my layout progress, I'm actually still in the design phase. I released a video yesterday contemplating a decision, because I'm building a bi-level and what is currently a 20 by 20 garage. We're actually fixing to enclose it, and it's going to be a 20 by 20 train room. And so I got a lot of feedback from a lot of people yesterday, and one of the things that really pointed out to me was a comment from David Atkins saying, if you're building a point to point, layout, don't put your yard on one end. Otherwise, one of your locals is going to go off to just straight out to staging, and it's not really doing any type of switching, because I'm wanting to get into the operations portion of it. So now I'm in the redesign phase on the bottom level, trying to figure out how can I put my yard with the engine facility.
Hey, Jason, speak up just a little bit. People are having a hard time hearing you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So now I'm just trying to figure out where to, to get everything to fit to where that yard is not on one end of the point, but somewhere in the middle. So that way I have industries on both ends.
Byron, before you jump in, because I know you've got an answer for this.
I just have a comment.
Okay, a comment.
Go ahead.
Sure.
But let's let Robert introduce himself real quick first, and then we'll get to that. So, Robert, who are you, and what are you modeling? What's your shed situation?
So right now I'm probably about 7/8 done with laying track. So I'm it's the shed's 14 by 34, and it's around the wall with a peninsula in the middle. So I did not want a 2-level layout. 1 level is expensive enough. So it's and I've got a nice yard and a bunch of industries depicting central Louisiana. So a lot of wood and paper, that kind of stuff.
And to tag on
petroleum.
to Robert, I actually got to go to his house last month and operate on his layout, and it was quite fun.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, and I'm in the middle of redoing some track right now, switches mainly. So because I was in operating, you find out your flaws. So
right.
And hopefully you do all of that before you start ballasting.
So Byron, I don't know if we want to. I joked a little bit earlier saying that the first step was to open CAD. I don't know if we want to get into your 3 steps of layout design first, or if you want to make a comment about Jason's sort of
Oh,
things that
yeah.
were what he was talking about with
Yeah.
the yard not being next to staging.
Right. And I think you can make an excellent argument either way, actually. What a lot of my clients have done, and a lot of my friends have done, is put the yard very close to staging at one end. The reason to do that, the reason to not do it, Jason, you talked about already, and that makes perfect sense. But the reason to put the main visible yard near staging is you turn those runs in that direction just into little transfer runs. Like the trains just arrived, they're bringing in cars, and it makes the other end of the railroad much longer. So it's probably less important for a switching layout, but for a mainline railroad, it can really make sense to put the yard close to the staging, and then you just have a yard operator, a yard master, run those trains like a transfer run to in and out of staging, but then the other runs are longer. And one of the reasons to think about that is just yards don't scale down in terms of time to operate. So the busier the yard is, the faster the trains over the main line, which is always too short, are going to arrive. And so you can get out of balance just in terms of the time. So just, you can make a good argument either way. I think there's a good argument, especially if it's mostly switching, that the visible yard could be in the middle or somewhere near the middle. But, you know, a lot of people have found that having it at one end also helps make those trains better.
Well, Jason, now that gives you something to think about. Yeah. So maybe we're going in a good direction.
I can make the argument in either way and be just as convincing.
Speaking about making arguments, Nisi J said a little bit earlier, it's easier to track plan when you have a story.
Yeah,
and I think that's a good segue into what is your actual first step?
Yeah, let me share a slide here. Let's see how this works this time. There it is. So this presentation I'm going to make at the NMRA National Convention in Santa Clara, although it's all virtual, but it's officially in Santa Clara in a few weeks, is called Make Only New Mistakes. And the idea is to look at how people design layouts and you know, see if there are things we can learn so we don't have to start over every time. Keith, I'm going to try the slideshow again and see if it'll work.
Go for it. What could go wrong?
Only everything.
Yeah, there's a joke that I didn't tell you about where people say blame Heath because I tend to make a lot of mistakes, and then we spend most of our live streams trying to fix them.
Oh, good. Okay, well then I'll fit right in. That's
exactly. I don't think it did get any bigger, but I think we're okay either way.
Did you see a slide change just now?
Nope, we're still on Make Only New Mistakes.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go to this next slide. And even though we lose my magical animation, I can talk through the animation, what you would have seen if the animation had worked. So I talk about layout design in kind of three phases, and they are not firm, hard phases. They are fuzzy and gray. The first is conceptual, which is unbounded. So you're thinking about a story you want to tell, just like that question commented. What's the theme? What do you want the layout to look like, work like? So it's a very unbounded stage. And most model railroaders have terrible trouble with this. They cannot unhook themselves from just plopping down track. The structural phase is next after you've got a concept, and maybe we'll talk about that some more. After you've got this idea, the story you want to tell, the structural phase is really like a footprint phase, and you're thinking about how to fit that into the space that you have. just as Heath was talking about, there are different shapes, different ways you can fit a layout into a room, and that's what the structural phase is. Now, at that point, the conceptual phase is very unbounded, not to scale. It's a wonderful, lovely, gauzy time. Structural phase is where it gets real a little, and you have to start doing things to scale. And so, even though it's not in a lot of detail yet, I will draw kind of roughly where a yard's going to go and roughly the length it needs to be, where the key curves are, and so on. Because you want to be sure that this thing you developed in the fuzzy phase will fit in the room. And then finally, eventually you get to detail like yard ladders.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of curious for people to. I'm curious if most people follow this method or if most people don't. So if you're in the chat, just say like yes, I do this or no, I don't, because I know personally when I got back into model railroading and I live in New York City, I've got very limited space, that I really almost started with the space and then sort of went back and figured out like what kind of concepts I could fit into the space. Once I sort of said, okay, like here's my room. If I put a loop around the room, where do I have space to put stuff? But I do, like Robert and Jason have more space than I do. So I guess I'm a little curious. Like Robert had a shed built and he had the people that build the shed do some of his bench work. So it kind of came with the shed. So I guess I'm a little, kind of curious if other people, how they do that as well. Like Drew Dudes is saying, I just open a CAD program and play around, see what fits. So.
And my contention is, and it's a little bit controversial, especially for that person, but if you go to CAD too soon, it puts the detail first and you paint yourself into a corner, potentially. So I think even with the small layout, I've done layouts that are a few square feet. I still start with the concept. What is this supposed to do? Because if you look at, these triangles there that would have been beautifully animated if you could have seen them, the amount of time you spend, certainly you spend a lot of time on the detail, but the importance really is weighted toward the conceptual phase, in my view, because otherwise you build a layout, it fits the room maybe, you cram in a lot of turnouts maybe, but it's not telling the story, or the story it's telling is pretty crazy. So it'll be interesting to see what your audience does. I think most people start with detail or structure. This three-phase concept is not common, but it really works really well for me. And I've done a couple hundred.
Lamar is saying he's getting ready for his 7th rebuild. That he didn't think a whole lot the first time. Thomas from Split Rock saying this is the perfect graph. Everyone worries and works on the band inside the gazebo in the park instead of fixing the wheels and bad switches. I do believe that setting the constraints, size of space, is the first thing to think about. Like in Heath's case, it also set the scale that he could use, which is actually something I don't think you've mentioned in all this stuff I've seen. You don't really talk about scale a lot.
Well, no. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that most of these principles are the same in all the scales. Where it gets different is how far you can reach, how big is a turnback curve, a blob, because they're too big to reach across in HO and larger scales. So you have to think about access. But I think even, everybody's got their own way. I'm not saying this is the only way for sure, because
I'm not saying that people that did it differently are wrong either. I just think it's just interesting to see, what methods people used. And I think like these next two comments are actually kind of similar in a way. Rail Artist says he just basically slaps the track down on the table and figures it out from there. And Andy Estep says it basically depends on what track he has, and he just uses what he has as he goes. So
that's, and I for for most of what I'm doing, it's a blank slate. There is a space usually that somebody needs to fill. Sometimes they're open on what the space is. It's going to be carved out of a big basement or something. So I start a lot of times with a white sheet of paper, but I have built my own layouts based on the turnouts that I had kicking around. So that's not, I wouldn't say that's bad, but I would just encourage people, even people who have done it other ways and, have had good success. If you take a step back and think about the story you're trying to tell, I think it will help you do those other things better. And that's, I just don't want to short circuit that thought about what are we trying to accomplish.
And Jason and Robert, I know both of them have railroads that they've kind of based their layouts around. Jason is Southern Pacific and Cotton Belt, and then Flying Crow is Canadian. I mean, what is it? Kansas City. Robert does KCS, and I always give him a hard time about the merger that may or may not be happening. But Jason and Robert, I'm curious, how much did the concept and the choice of railroad go into your layout designs?
Robert, you want to go first? You want me to go first?
Well, I guess what aspect are you talking about as far as concept? Because I knew what railroad I wanted to model, the area I wanted to model, and I knew the space I had. So, you have to think about all those things first, and maybe that's kind of what you're talking about in some sense.
Yeah, I don't worry too much about the space at the very first, because in the same space I could design 5 different layouts with 5 different stories to tell. So, you probably made a choice. I want to watch mainline trains. I want to do switching. I want to have a yard. I want to have this scene. You did all that informally and not in a structured way. So you probably did it without saying, "Oh, I'm going to work on the conceptual phase now, so I have to get the incense going and turn on some soft tinkly music, and then I will meditate and find my center, and then do my conceptual design."
Well, I think that's what people think sometimes with the conceptual phase, is that you have to say, okay, this is the conceptual phase now, and I am going to do A, B, C, D. And it is not necessarily that process.
Do you have Byron? Do you have a checklist or anything, or like just some standard questions that you send to people when you're like, if someone comes to you and says, I found your website, which is layoutvision.com, and I would like you to design a layout. Are there some standard questions you ask?
Yeah, so on the website, there's I think under the layout design tab, there's questions for prospective clients. And it's a little bit free form, and nobody ever does them all. I don't expect anyone to do them all. But it's actually a way for people to organize their thinking. And that works really well. So people tell me I'm more interested in switching, like probably Jason is, or I'm more interested in mainline running. I'm more interested in seeing the trains that I grew up with, or I'm more interested in operations. And so I basically get that, and from that I distill the concept for them. Usually they couldn't tell you their concept. They can answer a bunch of questions. And then when I go back to them and say, well, it sounds like you want to, like, for example, I did a design for actually a Louisiana railroad, but it was freelanced narrow gauge, cotton and wood products and so on. And the guy said, well, I think this is the shape. He drew something and scanned it and sent it to me. He says, I think this is the shape. So can you do that? Whoa. I didn't say that exactly. What I said was, interesting thought. Let's do this, because it sounds like the story you want to tell is mostly about cotton, and mostly about all the things and lumber and turpentine and these things that go with it. And you want to give some space. You want to have river crossings. You want to tell a story about what that part of Louisiana is like. And he said, that's what I said when I sent you the drawing. That's what I said, is I want to show what this part of Louisiana is like. So usually when I come up with a concept or something, they're going, yeah, that's what I said. That's exactly, because they do know, but it's all these different pieces. And in the meantime, they're drawing yard ladders. And they can't understand why they can't get to the next step. So Jason, you said yours is more of an industry switching kind of a focus.
So the way when I was envisioning this layout, and actually my previous layout, is I wanted a point-to-point railroad because ovals and circles, they just bore me to death. But I wanted something so that way, like if I had like family members come by, I wanted it to be able to, a single train or two trains run back and forth. So the way the that I envisioned it in my head is to have balloon loops on either end with a switch that could take it, those trains to the staging areas. So my staging yards are stub ended, with multiple tracks each. And all I have to do is just take the locomotive off of one end, move it to the other, and hey, I got a new train ready to go. But if I got family by who could care less of doing operations and they just want to see the train run, then it can just run through the whole layout. And so that's where I started as far as like figuring out how did I want the layout to flow. Not necessarily what's all going on the layout, but the space is the first thing. Then second is how is it going to flow, and then third, I started thinking of, okay, well, I want this type of yard with these type of industries around the yard. I've got a turntable, a 6-bay roundhouse, so things like that. And then I started thinking of, okay, well, I want this city, that's near, and then maybe a couple of towns that are on the outskirts with industries at each one. So that way I can have both mainline trains running through the layout, including passenger service, and then also local switching.
Yeah, so I think, what I would submit is not that you're wrong, because you're not. You did a great job. It sounds like you're homing in on exactly what you need to do. But you probably did the conceptual phase even before any of that, because you were thinking about, I'm really more focused on switching. That's the story I want to tell. That's the activity I want. I want to see these places that I know, or so you kind of were doing all that in the background. And some people do. A lot of people do, and there's no there's no reason to have a 3-step process. And we are now at step 1.7 of the 3-step process. But the thing that I find lots of model railroaders do is they just short circuit the whole thing, jump to some detailed thing that then is like an anchor. They just have to drag with them because they put too much time into it. Now they can't redo that staging yard because I spent 2 weekends on it, and it was all the monster I could find at the 7-Eleven. That thing that you drag with you may limit what you can do in the rest of the layout.
Steve Childers actually earlier was, I mean, it's kind of true, kind of a joke, but he says he spent 40 plus years on the layout concept, and then he modified his room to fit this concept that's been in his head for a long time.
Yeah, and you always, the very next phase after this conceptual phase where you're kind of thinking in free form is you got to fit it to the space. So, plans last until the first contact with the opposing force. But if the other thing the concept does, I think that's important, and I think Robert and Jason both, did this as part of their planning, it sounds like, is you keep coming back to the concept and testing things against it. Like, do I need a huge passenger station if I'm really focused on industrial? No. So that touchstone is there. you keep coming back to it, and you can, save yourself a lot of grief by being able to say, yeah, no, that doesn't fit. Now, I have to be more formal about it because it's not my concept, it's the client's concept. So I really have to pay close attention to it and not drift. But even for individuals designing for themselves, I think it's important. Yeah, so I can't hear you, Heath. Maybe other people can.
Heath, I think you went muted.
Oops, I apologize. My dog was barking at the bedroom door. There's nobody in the bedroom, but the dog wanted to go in the bedroom. Fred Wild said I held on way too long to what I had done. That's why it took me so long to say I need to start again.
It's a common refrain.
Yeah. One of the things I liked, and I've seen a lot of people do this, where like you put circles on your bench work to kind of figure out your radiuses. But what I thought was interesting, and if you have some examples you could show of this that I thought were really interesting, is that you use circles to help you define where the bench work should even be in the room.
Yeah.
And like you didn't, one of my second point was that, add 18-inch bench work around the outside of the room, or just like put a 4x8 in the center. And you had some really interesting examples that kind of went against that idea.
Yeah. So let me show just a couple quick slides. There it is.
You'll need to share again. Okay, you got it. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the same space, kind of the same concept, and 4 different footprints. So what I do with these is start putting, you're really just managing these blobs, these turnback curves, and finding places to put the turnback curves. The story this guy wanted to tell, this is a coastal Oregon railroad that interacts and interchanges with the SP. This railroad runs east-west. He had a big mill kit from BTS, and wanted that to fit somewhere on the layout. And so I was just kind of plunking down curves in different places, connecting them with relatively straight tracks. This is coastal mountainous Oregon, so the tracks curve. And then eventually what we settled on was something a little different, but very similar. So this is, you put these curves down, and by the way, this G shape, or J, yeah, it's a G, kind of a backwards G, upside down. I don't know. It's a G, I think. This G shape works in a lot of rooms because it holds down the number of turnback curves you need. So that's sort of one.
Yeah, one thing I like about this, just to point out too, is I noticed that your bench work kind of the bench work shapes itself around the trackage. Like it's not just a straight line across, so you're left with just whatever aisle you're left with. You've literally, in like the top right corner where the roundhouse is, there's like a little spot that somebody could actually kind of go in next to the roundhouse to get to the turntable, which just some nice little details of cutting out the space.
Yeah, and that's what I say in clinics and stuff is you want to modulate the bench work, not legislate the bench work. So you don't want to say, oh, I'm going to have 2 foot. Now, occasionally it's a modular layout or something like that, and you T-track and the bench work is fixed. But for most people, letting it curve is a better idea. Letting it curve puts more railroad in the same space, and still keeps your access. And partly because I'm designing for other people, I don't want to have someone show up on my doorstep with an axe in his hand saying, I just chopped down my layout with this because you did a terrible job and I couldn't reach anything. That has only happened in one nightmare. That has not actually happened really. But I'm designing it for someone else to build, and I want to keep them from making the mistakes that are all too easy to make. Once you say, oh, I could put another loop here, I can make this town deeper. And this all works great when you can still climb on the layout, still climb on the benchwork. But once either you start putting scenery down or you get too old, like me, you can't crawl on the benchwork to fix something. And so you really have to think about access, and the structural phase, the footprint phase, is really the time to think about access and reach, because this is your kind of your last chance to get it right before you start doing detail, and you don't want to drag that detail albatross along with you forever.
So just to restate them as well, your three steps are conceptual, structural, then detail. So we're on the structural phase now, but
Right.
you've showed us a layout with a lot of the detail already worked out on it, but we're just sort of, it's getting blended in a little bit. And like Nisi J just asked, in switching yards, the tracks seem much closer together than I thought was okay. What is the spacing for multiple straight tracks running parallel to each other?
Yeah, so I typically follow the NMRA guidelines, which is either S7 or S8. I can never remember which is which. You would think after 200 layouts I would remember, but I'm old. So straight tracks can be 2 inches, even in HO, we're talking about HO, and in this kind of the standard era, the transition early diesel era, they can be 2 inches apart-ish. But as soon as you start to curve, trains are going to sideswipe each other or cut across the middle, and you have to broaden those tracks. So these tracks, this is a pretty big chunk of layout. The yard tracks are, I think, 2 1/4 here.
Yeah, and it looks like you've got a lot of curve coming into them and throughout some of it as well. It looks like there might be some curves in it as well.
Yeah, they're very broad curves though. So typically when I curve tracks in a yard, when I can, they're very, very broad curves. If I can't make them very broad curves, then the spacing has to increase. And Heath, you mentioned that there seems to be a lot of detail in this. There really isn't very much detail. There are things drawn to scale. Well, I mean, there's more maybe than you expect, but there are things drawn to scale only so I know that they fit. So that's a real turntable outline. That's a real yard ladder that really could fit. So those things I do in detail, but you can see at Yaquina Bay, it's just like, yeah, there's some tracks there. I don't know, something like that.
I gotcha. Okay.
In Mill City, there on the bottom blob, that's the exact footprint of that kit because that had to fit. So I'm doing those things in the structural phase, unless it's a huge layout. I'm doing those things because I want to be sure that I don't shortchange it and get stuck with something that can't be designed later on.
So I do have a question for you, Byron. Going back to the slide where you showed like all the different options, one of the things that I saw that was pretty common, because I've got the turntable and the roundhouse, is I noticed that all your roundhouses was between where the person would be standing and operating and the turntable. So it's like you're facing the backside of the roundhouse instead of, the doors that the
Yeah,
locomotives would go in and out. Is there
yeah.
a reason why you do it that way?
In this particular, so it's a really good question. A lot of people want to look into the roundhouse, and a lot of my designs are done that way. In this case, he really wanted these roundhouses, the roundhouse is sort of too big for this layout, but he really wanted it, and the best way to, these turned out to be the best ways to fit it. So it's not something I do on purpose. Now, the one in the upper right corner of this this slide, I think it's 5-0. That one, there is an aisle below the layout that's drawn here. So in that one, you could see into the stalls, and the same way in the lower right corner, you'd be able to see in the stalls from that aisle below the layout. And it's not obvious in these drawings that there's an aisle below the layout, but there is. So those two you could see into. But yeah, it's a good question. A lot of people want to see in, and that may dictate, in the structural phase, this is where I'm doing it, and saying, okay, if you need the roundhouse to be turned that way, that's going to dictate other things. So it's all about priorities.
This might be getting a little bit into the detail area, but one of the things I was joking about earlier was using prototypical yard pictures to just sort of lay your trackage on your bench. And Andrew a step here says it's important to be able to see car numbers if you want to switch them. One of the things you talked a little bit about was that sometimes prototypical track plans don't translate well into model railroading.
Yeah, it's very true, and it's something that people are tempted to just say, I'm just going to take Tehachapi Loop, and it's this wide, and I'm going to scale it down to HO. Well, that still doesn't fit. They're going to scale it down, scale it down, scale it. But yeah, there are multiple reasons why. So that concept is called layout design elements, LDEs, where you take a piece of the prototype and then recreate it on the layout. I wish that Tony Custer, when he came up with this concept, had called them prototype design elements, because people use the term generally now and say, oh, I designed this LDE, it's a yard, but it's not an LDE if it's not, according to Custer, if it's not prototype. But the problem is, what works for the prototype when they have a lot of space and a lot of time between trains, relatively speaking, probably doesn't work for the layout, because we run many more trains in a given amount of time than the real railroad would. So we might need more crossovers. We might need a yard lead that the real railroad didn't have. You have to be able to adapt what the prototype did and not just scale down something you saw on Google Earth, even though that's not a bad place to start. But you have to recognize that you're building a model railroad, not a diorama. And so you have to be able to have the trains function, and sometimes that requires different things.
Would you mind going to the very end of your slide deck? You have some more slides, and I think one of the slides you showed was an 8x10 layout in the room, and in one of the slides you have it in the center of the room, and the other slides you showed around the outside, and then you also show a 4x8.
Yeah. So that's it. Well,
yeah,
I'll start here, and then we can get to the other thing.
And I think this falls under structural, I believe.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We're still in structural. So I had a client who had this kind of alcove in his basement, I think. The dotted red line on the my left here, I don't know which side it is, on the left side of the slide is it's a political boundary. There's an aisle out there, but nothing else. So he said, what I want to build is a layout that's 5 feet wide, leave myself 18-inch aisles, and that's what I want. Design me that. And I said, yeah, I could, but you'll hate me forever for it, and I can't deal with that kind of bad karma. So here's what you should build instead. So we curve the thing. There are some tight spots. There are still 18-inch aisles, but there are wider spots where somebody would stand to operate. And so, you want to see the space, not a rectangle, and think about how you can curve things. Again, we're still dealing with blobs. This is still a blob. We've got one curve inside another, which is a good space-saving technique. Over here, we have curves inside one another, but still, you've got this space you're still dealing with. And a lot of times I ask if anybody recognizes the track plan that the client asked me to adapt here. We'll see if anybody does and come back to it. Remind me.
I have a feeling I'm going to guess if anybody's going to recognize it, it's going to be Thomas Split Rock 323. But there might be some other people as well.
Yeah, it was a popular layout in its day, so I'll give you that. to give you that
Yeah.
clue. And then this is the thing, it doesn't work as well without the animations, but in fact, let me think if there's another slide in this deck that would be work better. But well, here's just an example of, so this is a 9x9 room, and again, we just started with the curves here. Now, by the way, in a 9x9 room, a 4x8 won't fit. You can't get the door open. You've got, only a foot at one end. A 4x8 doesn't fit, but something better does. So here, these are 22-inch radius curves. This might not be exactly the way I design it, but what you want to do is put the layout outside the room and put the people inside very often. So the people are in the middle. I'm pointing to the screen like you guys can see. The people in the middle here, let the layout be on the outside. Now, you would need some kind of hatch or an opening in these two areas to get to the track. But this is the kind of thing that people don't realize. They think a 4x8 is a small layout. It's not. A 4x8 takes at least an 8x10 room. And in an 8x10 room, you can do a lot of other things. So that's one of the areas where people, I think, get a little bit mesmerized by everything that's published in the Model Railroad Press. And they think, oh, I should have a 4x8 layout because that's what everybody does. In fact, everybody shouldn't necessarily. But
Andrew at Step is guessing Gory and Daffodid.
So the Gory and Defeated, good guess, not correct, but a good guess.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. I had probably nothing else intelligent to say anyway. So fine.
I don't know if this is structure or not, but you have a whole thing about helices, whatever the word is.
Yeah, you can. Yeah. So helixes. So helix. Helix.
It's not Inglenook sightings, Andy.
Yeah. Yeah. So a helix. Here are the challenges with helixes, and I'm not sure which slide to. We'll come back to it maybe, but
Yeah.
The problem with the helix is the curve in the helix creates more effective grade. So you design a helix, you say, oh, it's 24-inch radius in HO, and I need 4 inches clearance. You probably need a little more, actually. And so that's 2.3%. Beauty, I'm done. Ship it. The problem is that there's probably another 1.5% or more effective grade from friction going around the helix. Also, cars tend to derail across the center of the helix. We call that string lining. Some people use other words, more colorful, but string lining is the official name. And so you need a much bigger helix than you think. You need a broader helix than your minimum radius usually to make it work well, unless it's very short trains, very short cars, and you're willing to tinker. The other problem with the helix is the sucker is 5 square feet, 6 square feet, and that's a huge chunk of a model railroad, unless you've built a giant shed for your model railroad, or you've taken over the whole garage and your wife has to go outside in the rain. And how do you feel about that?
Jason's okay with it.
Yeah. So helixes are something that's kind of necessary in some cases, but they do not abrogate the laws of physics. And so that's a thing that I think people forget about, or hope they can forget about it, and then build something that doesn't work or isn't reliable, at least.
I like the solution you mentioned, though. The idea of, in most cases, one level is one area and another level is a completely different area.
Yeah.
And your suggestion was there's no reason that a train can't go off into staging and then a different train enters on the different level that's similar, but
but
maybe
not the
different.
exact same train. Yeah.
Yeah, so that they're the layouts are operating separately, so you don't need a helix, but there is still some cohesion in the operations of the two different levels.
Yeah, exactly. I've done a few layouts like this. The clients were very hard to convince because they had this idea that the train had to leave town A on the one level and arrive at town B on the second level, the same exact physical train.
Yeah.
But in fact, if you link them, as you're describing, by operations rather than with track, those two decks can be at whatever elevation you want. You don't have a lot of grade. You don't have a lot of hidden running. And if it's just a train that's going to go out and work a branch, which is very often what we do, is put the branch on one deck and kind of the main layer on another deck. The train runs off to the branch, which happens to just be staging. And another very similar train emerges from staging, maybe not even immediately. Maybe an hour or two later, the branch line crew shows up and says, oh, we're going to run this train. And oh, here's our train waiting at the junction. And they operate. So I've done this, a few times, maybe 10 out of 200 total layouts. And every one, the client was really reluctant and dubious about it, but they were all happy. A couple have been torn down because of moves, but it worked.
I was just gonna say I've got a similar situation on a layout that I go to sometimes that it's an operations layout completely, and so
Hey, Robert, I don't mean to cut you off. Can you just turn your fan out of the way? It's blowing against your mic.
Sorry, how's that?
Perfect, thank you.
Better.
All right, sorry. So what happens is in one operating session it's a single level layout, but it's huge. It's like 48 by 60 or something. So, but they do have two hidden tracks, and so in one operating session, the train will go to one of those hidden tracks and stay there for one or two more operating sessions, and then you'll bring it back out. And
Mhm.
it's a great way to add more just more operations without really doing anything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of like it's kind of along the lines what you're talking about.
Yeah, the basic premise I always have is stage when you can, build if you must. And I just saw a quick question from Steve.
Yeah,
Numbers.
wait, are you saying we have a train from one level show up on another level coming from staging yards?
Yes, exactly. It's like you went in that wormhole, and you're in one galaxy and then you're in the other galaxy all of a sudden. Yeah, so exactly. You build a train, and for example, let me think of one people won't know the places, but you build a train for a branch, I'll call it the Amboy branch, on the main deck, and this train heads off toward Amboy, but it's just going to staging, and just the yard crew and the transfer crew does that much. At some other point in the operating session, not even directly following it, somebody goes to Amboy Junction, which is on the other deck. Their train is waiting that you pre-staged there, which is similar to the train. It's got reefers, it's got hoppers for the grain elevators, it's got whatever would be needed on that train. It looks very similar to the train you sent to staging on the main deck, but it's another train, and that crew works Amboy on their upper deck, and then they run back to staging as if they're going to the yard, park and staging, and lather, rinse, repeat. So yes, Steve, that's exactly what happens.
And let's just take a second too. Like we're talking about yards, which is what we see on the layout, and then staging, which is off the layout, but is kind of just another yard, sort of like what.
Yeah.
Does every layout need a yard? Are yard staging? Like what? Like yeah.
Yeah. So all good questions. Let me just run through like a few slides here. First, does every layout need a yard? No. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is they do take up a lot of space. Not everybody likes to work yards. I love to work yards. Every layout I've ever built for myself has a yard of some kind, but yards can be pretty different. A yard isn't necessarily a big division point yard. A lot of yard switching in real life on a lightly used branch or secondary main line just happens out on the line. Like the train leaves the station with a dog's breakfast, it's just cars in any order. They go out to a stub end siding even and sort the train out, drill it out. Staging can represent, a big yard that's just out of sight over there. Staging is somewhere else. It's not a track configuration. It's not a yard necessarily. Staging, it represents someplace else. And there are a lot of ways to do that. The other thing to think about is there are different kinds of yards. There are big division point yards. It sounds like Jason might be building one, and probably Robert has one or more. But
Robert has one.
But there are smaller yards too. There are, junction yards where trains come together, an interchange yard where you connect to another railroad, industry support yard. Here in my area, there are a couple of these. One supports a big cement plant, and so the SP, now UP train, hauls a bunch of cars up there and leaves them and goes away. Takes the empties with them, and then the industry switcher switches them. So there are lots of different ways to do this. So Heath, I want to just check in on time. Could we spend 5 minutes on going through a few slides?
Yeah, actually, Tom of Tom's Trains and Things isn't going to be going on at 8 o'clock, which is 54 minutes from now. So there's nowhere for people to go except to enjoy our conversation.
Fabulous.
That's
I
not completely true, but yeah. So if you want to look for those slides, I do want to ask though too. You made the comment all the layouts you designed for yourself have a yard. So
Yes.
Being a layout designer, I'm sorry we skipped over this earlier, but you must have like an amazing layout at home.
It is fabulous. It's still in the conceptual phase, but it is fantastic. Wait till you see it. Yeah, I don't have it. I don't have a layout right now. The shoemaker's children do not have shoes quite often.
So you're in the NMRA.
Yes.
You're the editor of the LD SIG journal.
Yes.
And
Don't make it worse for me.
And you don't have a layout.
No. But
well, then you must be great at like scratch building. You're an MMR. You like.
See how he hurts me? You see how he hurts me? Yeah, I don't. I'm not a great scratch builder. I'm not a great modeler. I'm more akin to design and operations. I do actually seriously have a layout plan that's actually going to go in this very quite yellow room that I'm in, along 2 walls. And actually, I took a piece of advice that I often give clients. Eventually, I said, this sounds pretty good. Maybe I'll try it. And that is, you can always build a layout. It might be what my friend Dave Clemens calls a chainsaw layout, a layout that you build and know is not your long-term layout. But you're going to take it apart with a chainsaw when you move. But this layout that I'm going to build next is based on a little Rail Marine pocket terminal. They're pretty well known on the East Coast, but there were a few in the Bay Area as well. And it will have a yard. So it's great. It's all right here just now, but it's going to be great. And one other thing I just want to touch on, I think Heath and I talked a little bit pre-show about this. One of the great things about model railroading, especially today with the internet and YouTube and all of that, is that you can find your tribe. So, the layout design focused people, the operations focused people, the RPM folks that are doing tremendous modeling. There's all these different subsets, and you can easily find and connect to them today. So I happen to live in a really active area for the NMRA. So there's a lot of stuff going on all through the years, normally in non-pandemic years. And it's not true for everybody, but the NMRA has been a good way to make connections when I first moved to this area. And also, there's just a lot of stuff that goes on. And so I think finding your tribe is important. And I think not having artificial walls around who you hang out with in a model railroad sense can be really good.
You were going to show us some slides, but at this point, I've completely forgotten what the topic was on the slides you were going to show us.
Fortunately, I have not forgotten.
Good.
So we're going to talk about staging and how it helps you. And I'm just going to go through these relatively quickly. So let's take this imaginary.
You need to share again.
Oh, yeah, that would be good.
Yeah. While you're doing that, and I wrote it down to get back to it, but since we had a slight pause, can these design elements be combined with module type layouts?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is yes. There are a lot of seams in a modular layout, and so you have to kind of be aware of those. But that can work quite well. Again, the issue is, and it's especially acute with modular layouts where you're working with other people. You just got to be sure that you've got crossovers somewhere and enough passing sidings or whatever. So there's that element of just being sure that you have what's necessary to make your model railroad work, and so you just got to be aware of that. So just to run through this quickly, and then this right now is kind of the essence of moving of paring down your conceptual phase to something that might fit in your space and really reflects the story you want to tell. So let's take this imaginary hunk of real railroad, division points on each end, a junction yard in the middle, a helper grade, and so on. So maybe this is a piece of railroad that you really like, but it's way too big for your space. So how are you going to, frame and select pieces of that? One of the things I often suggest is to only do one big yard. Jason, this one's at one end because it's kind of a mainline railroad, and we're letting the staging represent that big yard. More yards and more layout off in that direction, and then the east staging represents that division point yard. So you only have to build one division point yard, and by putting the division point yard you build at one end, you avoid two short runs, have one longer run again with a mainline focus. So this is still a pretty big layout, but it's you're staging so that you don't have to build. You only build what you must and stage what you can. But let's say our focus is more on, I just want to do industry switching. I like the idea of through trains. I want to understand how I connect to the North American rail network. And so, maybe now we let both division point yards be represented by staging. And the yard we will model is just a junction yard where cars are going to set off and pick up blocks of cars. Maybe you generate the Fruitvale local out of that yard. So this is a smaller frame of the same area based on what you want to build and the space you have. And then
Jack is just saying a yard can be defined as two or more tracks, stub end or fork down.
Correct. Yeah. So a yard, the yard definition, that sounds close to the yard definition that's in most rule books, which is really about function, not about arrangement. So there can be yard limits is a whole nother topic, but there can be yard limits which define a place as a yard that's really just a bunch of industry tracks. Because what yard limits let you do is manage the flow of through traffic through the area without writing a lot of orders in timetable and train order or issuing a lot of track warrants or so on. So yeah, a yard is what it does, not what it looks like.
Hmm.
So here's another piece where maybe you just like the whole thing is staging practically, except for one little town where you're putting on and pulling off helpers, and another railroad is passing through with trackage rights because you want to see, you mostly model SP, but you want to see Santa Fe trains go by. So this again limits it. You're just taking different slices of this big conceptual pie to figure out what you want to build and what interests you the most. And you could just have one yard fed by staging in multiple directions and the local switching in that yard. So these are all different cuts at the same basic thing.
I finally understood why staging is sometimes called fiddle yards. It's what it never really clicked in my head.
Yeah, so a fiddle yard is an active staging yard where during a session, not between sessions, there's some human changing trains. The English use the term to kind of represent any sort of staging yard where you manually move the cars. Fiddle yards in the U.S., people talk about live staging. They talk about mole staging, and that's because the first couple of layouts that did it, the guy who was working on the live staging yard was kind of in a hole, like a mole, or it could have been his appearance. I don't know. Didn't meet the guy. Don't know the whole story. But live staging is this active staging where a person's making up and building up trains using their hands, usually, so that you can have a lot more trains in a session than you can store on the rails.
Nisi J is asking, what is the name of track used to build the yard? Is it just using turnouts? I've heard the term ladder, but don't see that in track.
Yeah, so good question. A yard ladder is just the arrangement of tracks, and it is made up of turnouts. Back in the day, there were a couple of manufacturers who would sell you a ladder pre-put together. Shinohara had, I think they were number 4s, and you bought like a ladder of 4 turnouts already built together. But generally, 99.9% of the time, when we talk about a ladder, we're talking about multiple turnouts.
I know Microengineering now makes a yard ladder turnout that just has a shorter.
Yeah,
it's part of their yard ladder system.
Yeah, so there are 5. Jason probably knows there are 5 turnouts in the system, of various arrangements. Some have a curved diverging leg. There's one that's too short to actually use standalone, that has to be connected in with the others, and that saves a little space, not as much as you would hope, but it's fine track, and I've designed layouts with that. So
see, for me, so like with my yard ladder on the previous layout, and I plan to do the same on this one, is I use number 6s. And of course, if you try to put a 6 after 6 after 6 after 6, that ladder gets extremely long.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I have to do is I have to trim down that straight leg of that turnout so that way I can get the next point a lot
so you get the track spacing you want.
Right.
Yeah. The other trick there, which you probably already know, is you can put a little bit of curve after the first turnout before you start the ladder. And it's only a few degrees of curve. So basically you're taking what is a number 6 ladder and putting it on maybe like a 5.5 angle. And then each successive track, and you probably have to trim them, just like you said, each successive track also has a little curve into the yard. And what that does is just might only save you a car length or 2, but it can, and the microengineering track is built to do this. It just changes that yard ladder angle a little to give you a little more room. And then the other thing some people are probably pretty familiar with is there's different kinds of yards. You can shape them like a pinwheel by putting each turnout on the diverging leg of the previous one. That kind of builds a curve into it. You can have compound ladders where there are sort of two ladders side by side. There are a lot of things when you get to that kind of detail.
Yeah, I definitely feel as an end scaler who, microengineering doesn't make yard ladders for yet. That's one of the reasons that I think I would ever get into hand laying track. Is just for yards and for that type of
yeah. And,
limitation of using standard stuff.
Yeah, as long as you're willing to do some trimming, and it's not that hard.
Yeah.
You can kind of customize things. So Heath, I don't know what you want to touch on next. I do have kind of a case study that goes from concept all the way to detail. If you want to go through that, it's probably 5 or 6 slides.
Right before we get to the case study, this is a little bit of scale question and a little bit of we've talked about like number 8 switches, number 6 switches, and all that kind of stuff. You made an interesting comment about like why use number 8 switches if your largest radius is 22-inch, a 22-inch curve. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and kind of connect those for some of us?
Yeah, so your standards should be in balance. You want to be able to have turnouts that kind of match with your curves. Otherwise, if you have 22-inch radius curves to keep the layout in the room, if you use number 8 turnouts with that, you're wasting the turnout, basically, wasting the length of the turnout because they're so long. Whereas, so the Atlas number 4 is actually a 4.5 frog. A lot of people don't know that. So it actually works pretty well with 22-inch curves as it happens. The number 5 is a good match for maybe a 24, 25, 26-inch curve. This is another thing that you can find in the NMRA standards. So trying to match and balance those things is really important. The other part of having that balance is you don't want to let one locomotive or one car dictate your whole layout, unless that's the one thing you have to have. Because one stiff brass engine may say, oh, I need to have 28 inches everywhere, whereas everything else you own would run on 25. And so, you got to decide what's important. It's always priorities, right?
So if you have to have one curve be a 22-inch radius curve because like that one section only allows for that, should you use broader curves elsewhere, or should you just put 22-inch curves everywhere and take advantage of the space you would gain by using the sharper corners?
That's a good question. And I think it depends on your priorities. First thing, if you have a 22-inch curve anywhere on your main line, that's your minimum radius. You can't say to me, oh, Byron, but I have 34-inch minimum radius, except for that one 22-inch radius curve that we don't talk about. Nope, your minimum radius is 22 inches, and some curves are too broad. But there can be reasons to mix your minimum radius or the radius that you're using. Maybe you have some scenes that you want to be more visually appealing, and they're not just to keep the railroad in the room. Let those curves broaden out, absolutely. So you want to, again, it's another case where you want to modulate your curve radius, not legislate, and really kind of use some thought about where I'm going to put these different kinds of curves. So let's see. So I guess if we could spend like 5-10 minutes on this, Heath.
You mind if I just show you
ahead.
one thing?
Oh, sure.
Because this is contradictory to what people think. Because everybody sees yard, oh, well, you have to have a departure and arrival track, and you have to have this, and you have to have that. And can you all see my screen?
Not yet, but now we can.
Okay, so this is an actual slick KCS standard location and inventory control. So this is
Hmm.
what the yard looked like. So you can see there's two through tracks as it curves, and as it heads north, you've got about 4 or 5 stub end tracks,
Hmm.
and there's no arrival departure track. There's
Right.
nothing like that.
Yeah.
It's just some industry, and it was mainly used kind of as a junction point yard and an interchange with Cotton Belt and Rock Island. So
Yep.
and SP and MOP. So that's all those kinds of.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of show you that this is something that everybody nowadays go, oh, that doesn't look like NMRA standards. Yeah, but this is a real yard. This is a real
Yeah.
functioning yard. So
Yeah. And there's no plenty of situations like this where and one of the things that happens is, as you guys know, yards get built for a time in the world, and then things change and the yard doesn't, and
Mm.
so they end up, having to work with what they have. But one or two
right,
double-ended tracks in a yard and the rest stub end is a great way to save some space and still get good functionality. Um, there are plenty of layouts around here that do that. I design plenty of layouts that way. And Split Rock, I see, is mentioning only the largest yards have arrival and departure tracks, dedicated arrival and departure. That's certainly true, especially hump yards have arrival and departure even yards. Um, but I will say the double-ended, if it's not a stub end yard where it's a branch terminal or something, having some double-ended tracks with switches on each end really helps in the prototype or the model, um, because you can exit without a backing move, and that's usually well worth the effort. But what real railroads do with smaller yards. So we're even a pretty big yard for us. 5, 6, 7, whatever tracks would be a pretty small yard on the real railroad. There might not be a yard master per se, or if there is, it's a footboard yard master that's out throwing switches. Um, so they will swing the purpose of tracks rather than say, if they have enough tracks, they will always say, okay, these tracks are the Murfreesboro tracks, these tracks are the SP interchange track, these cars are the Missouri Pacific interchange, and so on. They will dedicate. But a smaller yard, they're going to swing the purpose of the tracks from one classification to another through the day, or through the week. And that's something that we should do too on the smaller yards.
Just so you know, Byron, there are, at least from what I know, oh, Robert completely disappeared. There are at least 2 people in the chat that are currently working for railroads, and one who just retired
Oh, great! Well,
not
they
too
probably
long
know lots
ago.
more than I
So
do.
yeah, so that's
Yeah, I have. One of the things that's interesting is I have a number of clients who are ex-pro railroaders,
mm,
but they asked me to design their layout because designing a layout is different from working on the real railroad, and you have to make so many compromises that they weren't willing to make.
yeah,
So my job was just to say, yeah, I'm sorry, we can't
right.
do that here. You're in my world now, bruh. So
Yeah, we talk
that's been,
about what is it called? Compressive selection or something?
yeah. So
yeah,
yeah. Um, so people are familiar with selective compression, and
Selective
selective
compression.
compression. Well, I'm gonna turn that phrase on its head in a minute.
means you
Selective
can't have
compression
a
is where,
3,000-foot siding, right?
yeah, exactly. Or if you've got a long bridge that's five arches long, you make it 3 on the railroad.
Right.
And so that's selective compression. If there are 7 bays in a factory, you build 5 or whatever. That's selective compression. People kind of familiar with that. But there's also compressive selection, what I call compressive selection. And that means you choose a piece of the prototype that's more amenable to modeling. So rather than build a division point yard, for example, I'm going to choose another yard that still gives me yard activity and maybe an interchange and all of that, but I would choose the more modelable version. And that's a thing that people, it works great. People don't always think of it at first, but compressive selection, picking the thing that's more modelable rather than, the biggest thing. And I see people talking about how big prototype yards is. Yards they're miles long. And the other thing I noticed someone mentioned is that yard tracks can be different length, and that can be really handy in the model. One of the things I talk about in the full presentation that folks are going to see who join the convention is, and I'm not hiding it from you, we don't have that much time, is to use something called a lineal. And a lineal is the length of your target train. So maybe your target train is, 15 cars, and it's 10 feet or whatever it is. You can use that like a yardstick all around your layout. Staging needs to be about this. Passing sidings need to be about this, and so on. But in the yard, you may be able to say, I've got some trains that are shorter, locals or whatever. So some shorter tracks are going to be okay. So a mix of track lengths can be really helpful. Less the same cuts of cars, like a coal marshaling yard. A lot of times that's the same length of cars all the time.
Yeah, Jack was saying 24 50-foot boxcars is a quarter of a mile.
Yeah.
And how often do we put 24 boxcars, on our layouts? Not really,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I actually just did the math. A mile in HO scale is 60 feet in length.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're saying, I've got this yard that's 2 miles long, I'm just going to use 120 feet. Okay. What's it like building a layout in a gym? That must be cool. Is it nice? It seems nice. You gotta compress, and that's the name. That's what's tricky. But if you come back to your concept, my airy fairy concept, if you come back to that, that's your touchstone, and you could say, okay, I can make this compromise. I can't make that one. Yeah. So, example, Heath, you think?
Yeah. Let's do it. Sorry, I keep.
No, that's good. No, this has all been good. I mean, we're just doing what comes up.
This is such a great comment, and I'm just laughing because I so relate to this. Most people cannot justify spending hundreds of dollars to have somebody design a track plan for them, but will do several layouts instead.
Yeah. So I noticed the second part of the question is what really, besides that obvious point, is the reason for having someone like me do a track plan for you. There are a few things. The first thing is I will tell you no. I will say you can't do that. It doesn't work in your space. Let's rethink it. I will help. I help people a lot with what's practical in terms of again, this idea of lineals, train lengths, and how packed can something be. And I think it really helps to have an uninterested party. I mean, I'm interested, don't get me wrong, but it's not the layout that I've been dreaming of since I was 11. It's not the town that I grew up in. And so I can be a little more hard bitten about it and say, that just doesn't fit. Let's try this or this that still can relate to your concept. So let's see.
So let's take an example of if I worked with you. Let's go through the process.
Yeah. So
there's a good lead in right there.
Yeah. Thank you.
We got you.
Thank you. Thank you. Checks in the mail. So this railroad is called the Visalia Electric. It was electric at one time, and then later it was a steam and diesel-powered freight-only line connecting to the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe. So this client's interest was he wanted these signature scenes. There were 2 or 3 towns. He grew up in the area. There were 2 or 3 towns he was really fixated on, to almost an unhealthy degree, frankly. But one of them was Exeter, which was the headquarters of the railroad, where it connected to the SP. The other was Lemon Cove, which was an interesting place that was curved, had curved packing houses built along a curve in the railroad. Pretty interesting. He wanted a little bit of Southern Pacific so that it would tell the story of this connection. Was going to be a freight switching focus set in the 1950s, maybe backdating later to when electrics were running, which meant we needed a little broader curve. A few operators, 2, 3, 4, and a little breathing room between towns. So this is sort of the goals he had. There was a lot more than this, but this is kind of the thing. He wanted to experience the history of the area he grew up through operations. So he wanted it to look and feel like the real thing he remembered. So we started by narrowing down the signature scenes. Remember we talked about framing and cutting off. So Exeter, very important. And Exeter has the thing that I hate the most. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get that dramatic. I hate it. Ys are horrible in HO and larger scale. If all 3 legs have to be active, it's just a pain to find how to fit it in the room. Anyway, so Exeter, his number one thing, has a Y. Great. Then Lemon Cove, this interesting curve with the packing houses built along it. Then the next 2 were a place called Rocky Hill. Rocky Hill Horror Show is a different thing. And that had a branch connecting to it. And then a place called Merriman. So one of the interesting things before I jump to the next step is these are all these places are curved. So I was still in a very conceptual phase, but I put in the back of my mind, these places are curves. Model railroads have a lot of curves. This could work. So what I drew for myself was, and it was just on paper and pen, it wasn't this nice, was this conceptual map of how the real railroad connected to the SP, gold here, to the Santa Fe, in red here, and where those key places were located. They're drawn much larger to scale because I wanted to be sure to get those. And I was just trying to kind of see their relationships. So this is a very unbounded phase. I'm not thinking about the room. And as you're going to find out, the room has some problems. But I wanted to just get this concept thing in my mind and how these pieces could connect. So the space, so that was the conceptual phase. It was lovely. It was really nice before we got to the space. Things were great. And then we got to the space and things got a little worse. So big basement, great. Only 1 support column, great. A whole wall we couldn't use, not great. He's got some kind of a drainage problem, a leakage problem, seepage problem. That wall had to stay open. And so, okay, that's going to be an aisle or, something. So this is the space we had to deal with. And now everything's going to be to scale. Even if it's rough, it's going to be to scale because we're in that phase. So I hate Ys. And we're trying to find now places to plot the curves that will give us some straight tracks. We're going to use the no-fly zone for an aisle. And now I made the big compromise that took a while for him to accept. At the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that I just truncated the Exeter scene. Now, the reason I did this, the SP through trains are not his interest. what he's interested in is SP trains coming, interchanging with Exeter, and leaving. So, these trains are going to come from somewhere to here and leave again. And I knew they would be coming from more or less this direction compared to the Y. And this gives us a chance to fit the Y in the room and still let someone walk around it, because one of his other goals that I didn't list is he wants to walk in. He doesn't want to have to duck in or build any, if there is a lift out, it needs to be not absolutely necessary. So I always try a spiral, a G shape, a J shape, a spiral like the time tunnel when I was a kid, which none of you are old enough to remember. It was a pretty good show.
I remember it.
Okay, good. Thank you, Robert. Thanks for throwing me a bone there. So now this is a little misshapen, this spiral, because I know where it's going, because I already designed the layout. But we're starting up here, maybe. I'm pointing again, that's stupid. We're starting up here with staging. We're going to go around through Exeter. Ignore this truncated part, do not look at it. And then we're just going to go around and around, and it's a point-to-point railroad. The Vicey Electric itself is point-to-point, so I don't have to necessarily connect back. So maybe I can get away with just one blob, one turn-back curve. And a lot of times I will build what I call an anchored island, which means that it's against the wall in some places, but freestanding in a lot of the rest. So spiral could work. And actually, I'm kind of cheating by showing the shape of the eventual layout here, but this is sort of where I started, something very much like this. Now, we have these curved scenes, Lemon Cove. Cool, it fits in the right place. And because I had made that map, I knew relatively where it needed to be compared to all these other places. So Lemon Cove kind of fits, and that's beauty. Rocky Hill was just kind of a target of opportunity, because I thought maybe I can connect the branch there and just barely get by that door for the mechanical room. But I'll come back to that later. But Rocky Hill maybe could fit. Lemon Cove could fit. I've got 3 out of his 4. I could have phoned it in from here, but no, I kept working. Merriman was another great spot that he was interested in, fits. And there's a branch there that maybe the continuous run that he wanted but wasn't critical could be some kind of a lift gate. So now things are fitting together really well. And I have done pretty much my structural phase. I needed to find room for another few more towns, and then you fill in some details. So this is how the layout looked in the end. Again, Exeter was a key scene. Lemon Cove was a key scene. Rocky Hill and Merriman. But after those were down, then we could find other opportunities. Here's this branch to Fayette, and on to maybe connect on to El Mirador under the benchwork here. Not important, but so I just found opportunities for these different things. Viseo, there's a great old SP station that we could build as a narrow flat. There was a crawl space here that we needed to keep access to. That was another one of the problems. And he was just going to crawl over the layout with a step stool or something. So we went from conceptual, which was this very loose thing, just some towns that he liked, to the structural, which put us in the spiral format. And then once the key priorities were located, then we could just kind of plunk things down. So that was it was a really interesting project, and I enjoyed working on it a lot. But it was, and it took a long time to get to that point. It's not just half an hour and the structural phase is done. A couple more hours and the whole layout's done. It's a process.
Scale keeps coming up, but we haven't really talked about it yet. Do do people generally come to you and say, I want to do this scale? Or do people generally say, this is the concept, and then once you get into the structure phase, then you look at the space they have and say, why don't we choose this scale? Because then
Yeah,
we can do
usually,
more of what you want.
yeah, usually they've walked off that plank already. They already know what they can and can't do. They already have some equipment. A lot of people have closets full. I mean, it's so weird, model railroaders. Who would think? They have closets full of
We're
equipment.
collectors, we're not hoarders.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a collection. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
we could go on Antiques Roadshow and find out that it's worth 1/10 what we paid. But
Exactly.
usually, I would say 98, 99% of the time, people already are pretty committed to a scale. I have one or two people who have changed. Um, one was from O to HO, and the other one ended up in N, but I forget where he started. It was not, I might have been HO narrow gauge, but ended up in N just because he couldn't fit what he wanted to. But usually people are pretty committed to scale.
Yeah.
I have done a few layouts that were completely spec, where the person came to me and said, design the layout and I will build the room to fit.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool. And then you have to think about kind of best practices, like rectangular is usually better than square.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jason. But rectangular gives you a chance. I mean, if it's big enough, like 20 by 20 is great, and you should be able to do a lot with it. But rectangular sometimes will help you, build that G shape or something and get
Right.
longer
And
rooms.
and the way that I design mine is it's like that spiral. You spiral into the room. Now, I do have a helix, and the helix is actually going to be in the very center part of the room,
Hmm.
but on the top part of the helix will actually be an industry
Yeah,
within the center of it. So it looks like as a train's coming out of the helix, it actually comes around from nowhere.
yeah,
So
yeah. So that can work really well if it's a big enough room, and sounds like you've got that. Um, uh, so do the trains change direction at the top of the helix? Like if they're going left to right, do they come out coming right to left?
that's correct.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the one thing that some people, worry about. I think it's fine if that's what you need to do. What has really helped a lot of people is to really post the heck out of signs, so that people know east was right before, but now east
Mm.
is left,
Yeah.
to make that transition. So that really helps, and I think most people can adapt to it. But it's one of the things that happens a lot of times with the helix.
Well, and the other thing you can think of it as is like you were talking earlier about, multi-level, if you're going out of staging and then coming back, onto another level from staging, you're basically saying there's a huge gap in the line somewhere. And that's how I look at my helix. Like, okay, the train goes into the helix and I'm literally, and of course my layout's freelanced, but let's say that there's a 30-mile gap between when the train went into the helix and as the train's coming out,
Yeah,
of towns and stuff that could be in between, but we're not going to model that.
yeah, yeah. And that's the editing that you do of your concept, and you have this idea in mind, and that's a good way to do it. And I think it works either way, either with the helix as that quiet area in the middle when the trains disappear, or by having, two decks and separate staging.
And
Vinny
and
from BNSF 6951 actually has towns labeled on his helix, on each level of his
Yeah,
helix, as if
yeah.
it's um,
yeah,
kind of going through it. I do want to get to Al's question real quick, and then after Al's question, I just want to get into the LD SIG a little bit as well. But Al's saying, how do you come up with a plan when you have a very odd space, 3 doorways, and may need to remove sections to replace large items? Because
yeah.
I
It's a
think a
really
lot
good
of us
question.
run into these structural,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's
realities.
the structural phase. And the one thing I would say without seeing, your space, and I feel your pain. Uh, I have a lot of really ugly spaces that I have to work with. One thing that often is a great idea is anchoring it to the wall somewhere. If it can make sense with the schematic of the railroad and all of that, anchoring it to the wall gives you it just opens up the rest of the room. So that's something I usually try. As far as removable sections to get to like a water heater or um, furnace, I would just caution that you want to make sure that you don't have anything too critical on those sections, that you allow enough room for a worker to get in there, a repair person or something. Um, I I saw a layout that basically got destroyed because the guy built a helix around his water heater. He bought a 30-year water heater and thought that'll do it. And it turns out it was 30 years, like in dog years or something.
Yeah,
It didn't.
of
It was
course.
a very different kind of year than he expected. And they basically had to destroy a huge chunk of the layout to get the water heater out. Because his wife decided she wanted hot water more than the helix, which I
Yeah,
thought was kind of cruel.
gotta
But
make compromises. Gotta
yeah, what?
compromise.
So that would be my caution with something like that, where you're thinking about, I'm going to block in this thing and build my layout around it. Just got to be sure that you've thought about not only access to get the thing in or out, but space for the person to work on it and for them to actually get the thing out through your aisles. The other problem this layout had was there were spots where the aisles were so tight and so curved that they couldn't get the thing out, and they actually cut the water heater apart in the layout room. Took it out in pieces. They'll let the water out first. That was
Yeah,
fun.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I do want to get to as people know, I've posted the link to your website. You are a layout designer. That is currently how you make your money, but you're also involved in the NMRA's LD SIG.
Right.
And it's my understanding that the LD SIG is, I mean, it costs money to get the journal if you want to get the
Yeah.
journal, but to like go to the conventions and like have conversations and do all that kind of stuff. My understanding is it doesn't really cost anything, or it's very minimal cost. So
Yes.
there's
Yeah. So this is the magazine, the LDJ, the Layout Design Journal, and it comes out periodically, uh, depending on what else is going on in my life and what kind of material we have. But you can join for, I think it's $17 for 4 issues, however long it takes us to get those out. And that's with online delivery of the issues. You get them as PDFs. You can also get a print magazine, which is more expensive. I think it's 40. I should know that. But when you're a member, you can participate in. We have for normal conventions, we have a layout tour that's just for the LD SIG. I think the magazine is great. Editor's a fantastic guy, really smart.
do you want to
And
throw his name out there, Byron?
yeah, I don't want to embarrass him,
Okay.
Uh, but and really, so the Layout Design Journal, we try to take kind of the next step beyond the basics, and explore different ideas that people have had.
Do you
So,
have to be in the NMRA to sign up to get the LD?
boy, such a great question. I thought so, which is why I joined the NMRA in the first place, because I wanted to join the LD SIG. But you do not. So the Layout Design SIG or the Operation SIG or the Steel Modeling SIG, you don't actually have to be an NMRA member, even though they're kind of under the umbrella of the SIG, of the NMRA. So they're independent. Most of them are 501c3 educational organizations, and most of the help is volunteers. 99% of the people are volunteers. And so I think it's an excellent investment. Even long before I was the editor or did this for a living, I was a layout design member. Besides the journal, we also have activities at the national and regional meets. There are a lot of things that we do that don't require membership. For example, we will, at conventions, we offer layout design consultations. Smart guys, all guys so far, will offer help with a layout design and give you a half an hour consultation for free. That happens at regional meets and national meets. There are a lot of layout design SIG members presenting clinics at the convention. For $50 a convention membership, a convention registration, I think will expose you to a lot of really fascinating things. There used to be, and I believe there still is, an NMRA trial membership, but I think the Santa Clara convention is open even to non-NMRA members.
It is. That's correct. Yeah, you can just pay the $49. You don't need to be a member.
Yeah, and that's a
for
great
the 80
deal.
hours of content.
Yeah, it's and the content is going to be not just live, but also a lot of the clinics will be recorded and available for, I think they're now saying 4 weeks after the actual event, which begins July 6th. So, I really have had great experience with the layout design SIG, met great people, seen a lot of layouts that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. I just think if you're interested in layout design, if you're just going to design one layout for yourself, it might be overkill. But if you're interested in layout design as a concept and as a thing to learn more about, I would highly recommend it.
How does the CEO, the CFO of Layout Vision feel about you giving away all of your tips and tricks as the editor of the Layout Design Journal for only $17?
One of the best things about working for yourself is you can decide when to kind of cheat yourself a little bit when you want to do something you enjoy. And so I find it, I like helping. One of the things that we often say is every model railroader has limitations of time, space, and money, but knowledge is free. And so or for a very low cost, just $17. So, we want to share as much of that as we can. And just those links. Good question, Split Rock 323. The LDSIG will have breakout rooms during the virtual convention, so you can hobnob with people who are interested. There'll be Zoom breakouts. We also will be doing, including me, we'll be doing volunteer 40-minute, 45-minute consultations. So if you are registered for the convention, and there will be a limited number of time slots with me and with other smart guys. Again, all guys so far. Would be happy to have a female, but so far all guys. You can spend time with one of us and get some ideas for no additional charge beyond the cost of the convention. You don't have to be a SIG member, but you do have to be registered for the convention for that. I think the convention, there are people from all over the world presenting clinics, more so than in a physical convention. I think more variety from different places.
Yeah.
And the fact now that they're going to leave them up for a few weeks, I think is really makes it even more worthwhile.
Yeah, at least 2 weeks after the convention, you'll get to watch all the presentations again,
Right.
or if you missed one, you can go back and watch it, which is pretty cool. But
and each clinic will have a discussion session afterwards. those will not be captured. Those are not recorded, but the main body of the clinic will be. And I'm looking forward to a number of them. I'm going to be doing a few consultations, but I hope to see some of the clinics too.
It is 8 o'clock, Byron, and I want to respect your time. Do you have time? I don't know if people have questions, but if people have questions,
I
do you
would
have a little
love
bit of
to
time?
answer questions.
Awesome. So if people have any questions, start putting them in the chat. I can see Jason's thinking. Jason's going to have a question. But while people are thinking about questions, I do just want to take a second and thank all of the individual supporters as well as the channel sponsors. So a question came in, where is the convention at?
Yeah, so it's in the ether, man. It's
Really?
it's completely virtual. It was going to be in Santa Clara. Oh, good, thank you.
Yeah, here's the slide on it. If you go to nmra2021.com.
Yeah. So and we had to make a decision. Not we, the organizers had to make a decision in January about whether to have a physical convention or not, because you had to put in non-refundable deposits, and things just looked pretty sketchy at that point. So they decided to go virtual, which I think was the right decision, especially at the time.
So Jason, I see smoke coming out. You got a question?
Oh, not really. No,
No.
I just wanted to say Byron made my day because after reading that comment, on my feedback yesterday, I started brainstorming on trying to move that yard somewhere in the middle of the layout plan. I'm going to keep it where it's at. So that means my work is done on the design.
You see, even just on a live stream, I can help you. No, I think that's
Yeah.
I think just think about making those moves from staging some kind of a transfer move. Maybe the yard master can do it, or something, and save the long runs for the rest of the group. Great.
Split Rock's asking, would you recommend Craig? No, I'm not even going to attempt his last name. 10 Commandments of Yard Design.
Yeah, so Craig Biscayr is a good friend of mine. We have a couple minor disagreements about the 10 Commandments of Yard Design, but they're around the edges. They're not so the basic points he makes are great. He's more committed to the idea of dedicated arrival departure yards than I think is justified for most model railroad applications. But yard leads, yes, especially in the model, because the trains are just coming too fast. Where a real railroad might not have a yard lead for a small yard out on a secondary main. We need them because the trains are whizzing past. 90. I'd say Craig and I are in 95% agreement on the 10 Commandments. But
that's really good for model railroaders.
Yeah.
Because if you ask 5 model railroaders their opinion, guaranteed you're going to get 20 separate opinions because they don't even agree with themselves.
Yes, that's very true.
95% agreement's good.
Has a fantastic layout himself that he's building of like an 1890s era. It's all scratch building. So he's pioneering a lot of things in 3D printing and pretty interesting stuff.
Robert, did you have a question?
You know what I would like? Probably would take your time, but it would be good to have send my track plan to you, and then you could go, oh, you're a dumbass, or you
I would never
that
say
looks
that to you,
okay.
I would never say that to you.
Uh,
Um,
or can I
I
rip
have
it up
done that.
right now? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, if you don't have the chainsaw out right now, get the chainsaw. We
Get the
can't talk
change.
until you have the chainsaw in your hands.
Uh,
I have done that for a few people. It's uh, it depends. The person has to really. It's like anything else. The person really has to want to change. I think if people are willing to make a change, I'm always happy to do that. Um, eh, eh, right now, it's weird with the pandemic. One thing no one needs to know, but I find fascinating, is that my backlog is huge.
really?
Mm,
Yeah,
I would imagine.
yeah, which is not usually the case. Usually the summer, it's it
yeah.
whittles down. But I'm booking clients into January now. But if there's anybody out there who thinks they want a second opinion, that is something that I do, and sometimes I can work it around other projects. Um, and you know, some people have made big changes based on the suggestions, and other people are like, that guy doesn't even have a layout. Why am I listening to him?
Fred wants to know,
Good to
what
know.
design software have you used and do you use? I know a lot of people in chat were talking about AnyRail. I saw
Yeah,
one person mention ExtraCAD,
yeah,
Railroad Modeler Pro for the Mac users.
Yeah, I
yeah.
use
So
SCARM is what I used when I did mine. So
yeah, so SCARM is freeware. ExtractCAD is open source. We don't call it freeware. Open source. I use Third Planet. Um, and the main reason I used AnyRail did not exist when I got started with this. I would have given it a good look. Um, the Third Planet interface is more like a Windows program. You click, hold, and move things,
Mm,
whereas ExtractCAD, I think SCARM, CAD Rail, those are more like a traditional CAD program where you click, move the mouse, click again. And that just did not work for me. Um, so Third Planet has been great. For me, I use about 10% of its features, just like I use about 10% of my mind.
yeah.
Um, the Third Planet, there's a lot of focus on 3D and running trains, and I don't ever do any of that for clients because it just takes a long time. So I'm a happy Third Planet user. It's what's a one guy operation, as most of these things are. But if I were starting over now, I would, excuse me, I would certainly look at AnyRail too.
Mm.
I like the way Third Planet does flex track a little better than AnyRail. Um, and I haven't done enough with SCARM to have an opinion.
John Abaticola, TSG Multimedia, says
Oh
hello.
yeah.
Split Rack 323, have you ever talked anyone out of building a Helix?
Yes.
Was it
Yes.
hard?
Yes. It was very hard. And they are so grateful.
Mm,
So grateful. Um, I've talked probably just this week, I talked a guy out of a Helix. Because here's the situation: 13 by 14-foot room, which is, a good room. Designed a lot of layouts for that sort of mid-sized space. But he wanted a Helix. And I said, look, that's 6 square feet. 6 feet square.
you talked Mike Cohen
Yeah, I
up?
did talk. Yeah, I talked Mike out of it, but I'm about to talk him back into it. We're going to do some more work, Mike and I. So I just pointed out to him that it's 6 feet of space in his room. It wasn't going to leave a lot because of where the doors were, there were issues. So instead, what we're doing is we're doing tiers. So the track's on 2 levels, but not a separate deck. And it's a thing that used to be very popular, and then people said, "Oh, it's a spaghetti bowl, and you don't want to do that." But if you design it carefully, and you set it up so the towns aren't right on top of each other, maybe use a creek or some foliage to separate the two lines. It can really work. Yes, I agree, split rock friends, don't let friends build helixes, except if you've got a big enough space.
Yeah.
Jason's got enough space.
Yeah.
And certainly Robert's got enough space. But you just gotta, the helix, as I said, it just doesn't abrogate the laws of physics. You got to pay the piper somewhere.
I think this is an interesting comment, and I'm curious if there's any data on it. In all truth, I imagine most model railroaders do not have a layout. And I wonder how many do or don't. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't technically have a layout. Jason doesn't have a layout right now, currently. You don't
My
have a
son
layout.
does.
So, like, just using this small group,
It's 75%. It's
yeah, we're
it's a
we're
complete
already
sham. The whole hobby.
we're skewing the results already.
And John is right. Guy Cantwell's layout is one where the helix really is important. But again, kind of bigger space. As far as the other question, I think there are a lot of armchair modelers. There are a lot of armchair Corvette drivers too.
Right.
People that are interested in Corvettes and don't own one. And one of the things I hope I have done, and maybe have done a little, is in doing clinics and stuff, try to convince people to suggest to people that, start where you are. Start with a space you have. A 4-foot N-track module definitely counts. I built so I think trying to encourage people to get started. I designed a great layout. Turned out to be a great layout based on 2 4-foot T-track modules. It's on my website. It's a brewery in Southern California and an associated yard. Model railroaders love breweries. I don't know what it is. And you can
Have
put
you
these
been to
modules.
the British region of the NMRA? Speaking
I have
about
not.
beer drinkers, anyway.
Yeah, but a couple of one N-track module or a couple, a single T-track module is tough, but when you put 2 or 3 together, or a 4-up module, that's a model railroad, and you can get some practice building. You can do a lot with it. So I would consider somebody with 1 module definitely a model railroader. Somebody who's just interested is a model railroader, but they don't all have layouts. I don't know what the percentage would be. Probably less than 50% have layouts right now.
And this is along the same lines of people without layouts and people without helices. Everyone complains about them and how you shouldn't build one, but most large layouts, people have them.
Yeah, again, it's size. If the layout's big enough so that the helix doesn't dominate the room and compromise everything else, sure. I mean, I designed plenty of layouts with helixes, but you can't put them everywhere. So I shouldn't. Yeah.
And another one without a home layout at the time. He says he try like hell to avoid a helix and especially duck unders.
Yeah, and I think John has seen a lot of layouts, so he knows what works and what doesn't work. I think the more you see them, the more you realize that every layout is a compromise in some way, and it's the choice of compromise that makes it satisfactory to you or not. And that comes back to the concept. If I have to be like a layout from 101 track plans where I have to keep popping up like a prairie dog in different parts of the layout, that doesn't match my concept, doesn't match my need. I think everything's a compromise, but you can choose wisely.
Yeah, compromise is something we don't like to always admit we have to do, but yeah. Let's see.
I do have a question. As far as the helix goes, what is the minimum radius do you recommend, say, for like a 4-inch rise?
Yeah, so I try to go 28 inches or larger, usually larger, 30, 32, if I can, depending on the space. I'm working on a layout right now that's 30 and 32 and a half are the helix radii, and it's a 4.5-inch rise. A lot depends on how you're going to support the turns, how much space you need, because the elevation are railhead to railhead. So whatever you have for the deck, it's taken away from that. So if you say, I'm just going to go 4 inches, but you have a 1/2 inch or a 3/4 inch deck, that does not leave very much space. And
Right.
what is your era, Jason?
Technically, I've got 3 different eras, but I'm starting with 1960.
Yeah. So you have to build, as you know, you have to build based on your worst, your most demanding era. So if
Which
you're
would be
planning to run,
96 with the double stacks.
yeah.
Now,
So
so
I'd probably,
my previous layout, I did have a helix. It was a 29.5-inch radius. This one I'm going up to 32. I used 1/4-inch plywood as the decking, and I had 1x4s as the uprights.
mhm,
And it was tall enough,
yeah,
for a 4-inch from, the height of the rail to the next height of the rail, for that double stack container to fit
good.
under. And I've got
Yeah,
one of the NMRA track gauge things, a little flat piece of metal, and I use that to make sure, because that's supposed to let you know as far as like tunnel clearances and things as
yeah.
well.
So a couple of tricky bits there. If it worked, it worked, and so that's good. And the radius is broad enough. It sounds like not all, especially container cars, double stack containers, not all are built to scale.
Okay.
So sometimes
Mm.
you can be just a little bit over, and uh, so and you need to get your hands in there. So a lot depends on the access. In the thing you're talking about now, where the helix is in the center of the room, kind of, you'll have access all around. That's going to be better. But if you have to get your hand in and reach back in around somehow, you need more clearance. So Heath, there was another question.
Yeah. Looking
There
for
it
a
is.
planning resource for modern commuter railroads. Would like to
Yeah,
model the Northeast Quarter and New Jersey Transit.
yeah. So I hope you have a gymnasium. Congratulations on that. But actually, I shouldn't say that, because you can build commuter into a much smaller space if you're smart about it. RMC, Railroad Model Craftsman, just did some issues on commuter, and I've only seen 1 or 2 of them, but they had some good ideas there. Um, uh, and beyond that, it's not an area that a lot of people model, or a lot of people design layouts for. So I think the key thing again is, especially, it sounds like if it's Northeast Quarter, it's probably not push pull. The nice thing about Chicago, I've done a couple of Chicago um, uh, transit commuter layouts, and they're push pull. So staging can be stub end, and it really
Mm.
saves a lot of space.
I know the Sunnyside yard does have a turnaround, but I thought
It
they
does.
did do a bunch of push pull though. I feel like a lot of times they do just pull into Penn Station and then back out of it.
Yeah.
So I
I
think
don't know about,
it depends. Yeah.
Northeast Corridor. Commuter can takes on different flavors in different places.
Okay.
And here in Northern California, it's push pull, and it makes things a lot easier from a design standpoint.
Right. Well, Byron, I really appreciate all your time today. Appreciate you staying extra, answering some questions. I think Split Rack 323, the ultimate lesson from Byron. Every layout is a compromise, and
That's
I
true.
think that's absolutely correct.
And I would just add one more lesson before you wrap up.
Okay.
Draw no line before it is time. So don't do the detail too soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really
My
appreciate you
pleasure.
being
Thank
here,
you for
and
having
I'll
me.
see you at the convention in a couple weeks.
Yeah, great. Jason, Robert, nice to meet you
Thank
guys.
you,
Nice to
Byron.
meet you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, viewers.
It's all about humanity. About It's all about humanity. About It's all about humanity. It's all about humanity.